Okay, so now today we're going to introduce the idea of the inverse trig function. Now, I'm going to show you the notation for the inverse trig function, but then I'm going to give you a warning not to confuse it with the reciprocal because it's not the same thing. Okay, so now when we look at the sine, for example, the sine of an angle equals what? Opposite over hypotenuse, so it equals y over r in general, right? That's the function. Now, what if we want to find the angle though? Now the angle is in the function, it's a function of, so we can't just, and again this is a common mistake that students will make, you can't just take that angle out of there, right? And I've seen a lot of creative ways that students do it wrong, okay? So think of this as any function, right? If you have a function, right, if you have f of x equal to some function of x, right, and you want to solve for an inverse function, well, you would find the inverse of the function to undo it. Okay, for example, if I have f of x equal to the square root of x, well, the inverse function is the function that undoes this operation. So the inverse of this function would be denoted f inverse, right? So the power, the -1 power, is not a power. Okay, it looks like a power, but this means an inverse. Okay, so it's f inverse of x would be the function that undoes the square root of x, which is x squared. Okay? Just like you look at multiplication and division as inverse operations. They're operations that undo each other. Addition and subtraction are inverse operations. They undo each other. Okay? So when we talk about trig functions and we want to find an angle, well, we need an inverse function that's going to undo the sine function. Well, that's where the inverse sine comes in. Okay, so we would say we would have sine inverse of theta. Okay, or what we call arc sine, but it's an inverse sine. So what that means is if I want to undo sine, let's say I want to solve. Let's say I want to solve for theta. I want theta. I want to find what theta is, right? And let's say I'm given the ratio of 3/4, and I want to find, okay, what angle has a sine equal to 3/4? So the sine of what angle equals 3/4? How do I answer that question? Well, the inverse sine operation is what's going to help us. Because if I take the inverse sine of both sides, so let me write it this way. Right? So now, sine and inverse sine are inverse operations of each other. So what happens? They undo each other and we get theta out of there. Okay? And so we get theta equals inverse sine of the opposite over the hypotenuse, or in this case 3/4. Okay? And then if we find the inverse, right, the inverse sine of 3/4, and we get approximately 48.59 degrees. Oh, what was it again? 40, I said it, I can't believe it. 48.59, okay. Okay, and so that's the angle. So that's what we mean by using inverse functions. So now we're going to include, or now we're going to start working with inverse functions to find angles. And then we can also do these on our calculator as well. Okay, so that's it. So we'll do some examples and we'll move on. Take care.